Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive, the podcast that skips small talk and goes straight for the concepts that shape our thinking and behavior. In this podcast, cold expertise is defenestrated as warm philosophy is enthroned in an attempt to explore the field in which we're all scientists looking for answers, living well. Hello world, welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive with Eyal Shai. Today I'm joined by David MacIver. Hi David.
Hi Al. Hi Eyal. Immediately messed up your name.
No problem.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. And what will we be discussing today, roughly?
So the theme that I'm want to talk about today is roughly headlined as taking things seriously. It's part of sort of a life project I've been going on for a couple of years where essentially at some point I decided that I was kind of miserable and that seemed like a problem and I should fix that. And this wasn't my original frame, but I think there's a question that goes around from time to time of like, if you're so smart, why aren't you happy? And that's increasingly how I think of this. It's essentially the trying to turn your intelligence and like normal practical problem skills to the problem of like actually living a good life and actually being happy.
That's great. And, it's right up this podcast's alley. How would you like to begin your story? I mean, I would love to get an insight, and I know that you're a talented writer. How would you describe the years where you are not happy, though you're smart? So can you take us on a little tour of what it looks like from the inside?
Sure. So my background is software development, and I still sort of morally think of myself as a software developer, despite the fact that I'm not actually writing any code at the moment at all. And I kind of drifted into this. I think I was sort of living my life very much and still to some degree live my life this way of like doing what makes sense at the time. So I started out with an intent of becoming a physicist, and I did mathematics with physics at university, which then sort of slided into mathematics, and I got to the end and I became a software developer because essentially what else could I do? I mean, I could have gone into academia, but that didn't work for other reasons. And so I kept essentially like taking the opportunities in front of me, and everything was basically fine. Like I was, I had a decent job. I had like reasonably good social life. Like nothing was badly wrong, but also nothing was particularly good. I sort of spent the period. So to give you a timeline, essentially, like I quit my normal software development career back in 2015, when I had moved country to work at Google. After about 6 months, I was just like, wow, this is the worst. I hate this. And just quit. And so then sort of started working on some interesting software side projects and was doing which I turned one of into an attempt to do a PhD, which I've now technically I have suspended my PhD rather than quit my PhD, but in practice I've probably quit my PhD. I mean, I was going to quit my PhD, but then they persuaded me to put it on suspension anyway. And so it was during like the first or second year of my PhD where I just sort of looked at my life and I was just like, man, I'm really unhappy with all of this. Like this is sort of where I've ended up rather than where I've chosen to be. And I clearly don't feel like this is where I want to be. And I should, I should essentially see what's up with that and try and fix that. So I did what any self-respecting nerd would do, which is that I read 1 million books on the subject and started trying to figure things out. This isn't quite true. I I did see a therapist for a bit. And what I largely concluded was that I was smarter than my therapist, and I was spending the entire session essentially like trying to bring her up to speed. And after about 6 sessions, I was like, you know what? This is stuff that I could do much better on my own than sort of part like and all credit to her. Like, I think it just wasn't actually a good therapist client fit. I think like she was probably a very good therapist for the right sort of person, but I think she essentially wasn't used to like slightly neurodivergent nerds. Um, and so started reading up a lot of the therapy literature. I've since sort of branched out more into philosophy as well, and a whole bunch of like more woo-ish self-help books, which are often really interesting sources of insights. They're terrible, but they're often really interesting. I just try and synthesize it into like a good toolkit for for doing for getting better at my life. But it all kind of starts with like the core insight of you're allowed to treat your life as a project with interesting problems that you can think about and then try to solve.
Yeah, so I want us, before we go on, to actually learn about the kind of techniques and methods that you've added to Arsenal in your attempt to live well. Maybe a little bit more of a backstory. Like, how do you view yourself emotionally, let's say, growing up? Like, what is the base mood? Do you have a base mood or some mood that is kind of the default for you? So was that a continuation of yourself when you were in the first year of your studies, whenever the crisis happened? Where were you emotionally? Was it that you were finding yourself being sad, or not seeing much of a future, or what did it feel like?
I would describe myself as depressed more than sad. It was like it wasn't that I was overwhelmed with negative emotions. It was that there was a distinct lack of positive emotions. It's a lot of my conception of depression comes from the philosopher Matthew Radcliffe, and he talks about depression as essentially comprised of what he calls existential feelings, which he uses as a contrast to intentional feelings, which are feelings about something. And sort of existential feelings are feelings that constitute your experience of the world, and sort of like his classic example is like hope versus hopelessness. Like hope is about something, like you hope for a particular thing, while hopelessness isn't about something. It's more than like a lack of hope. It is a feeling that hope is impossible. So my personal experience of depression is that it's very much constituted by this sort of like these feelings of like not just the absence of positive feelings, but like that such positive feelings are impossible. And I'm lucky in that like one of the things that tends to stay with me, even when depressed, is like some level of interest in things. Although I'm increasingly finding the limitations of that. It wasn't, so yeah, I guess like it wasn't just that I was unhappy in the sense that like everything felt terrible. It was unhappy in the sense that like happiness felt hard to impossible to experience.
Yeah, I can sympathize with that. I mean, I went through a period of depression in my teenage years, and I think it was a different shade of depression, which is to be expected because no two people are the same. So for me, I think it was marked by sadness, or what I interpreted as sadness. But I have kind of my own little theory of depression and of other things, that it is overwhelming in the sense not that you're bombarded with feelings all the time, but a sense that you're really not sure what your next move in the world should be. So you're in a sense paralyzed. Obviously, you lack motivation in that context, and then this type of paralysis and apathy almost can then be interpreted as chronic sadness or chronic something. So people may misinterpret this overwhelm, paralysis, and attach it to an emotion. But I think it's a lot like you say, it's not necessarily an emotional thing. Yeah, so just on a side note, that's interesting that it's connecting there. Yeah, so I'd really like to hear from you. What were some of the first building blocks that maybe started falling into place for you in this new project that you were undertaking? Were you, well, maybe we should start, were you explicitly thinking about a concept like living well, or what was the name of the project?
I don't know that I ever had a name of the a single coherent name of the project. Like, I think it's had various labels over the years, but I think the starting point was more like how to be happy, how to sort of figure out my own emotional state. And a sort of a project that I've attached a project name that I've sort of used somewhat tongue-in-cheekly over the years, but like I still think is pretty sound, is essentially how to think your way out of depression.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe, well, I just have to hear that spoiler. Can you think your way out of it?
I think that you cannot purely think your way out of depression. Like, you have to act to some degree as well. But I think that they're good. I think short answer, yes. Long answer, it's complicated. And the starting point I have for a lot of this is that a lot of people conceptualize depression as like a very thinky experience. It's you talked about how depression is sort of paralysis, how it's a lack of knowing what to do next. And I think for a lot of people, the key experience of that is basically getting into these analysis paralysis loops where like you're constantly ruminating, you have these thought cycles, and so they frame the problem as I need to think less and I need to sort of feel and do things and so on and so forth. And like, this is a perfectly valid way of conceptualizing that. If that works for you, great. But my sort of feeling on the subject is that the thinking that they are describing as depressed, as like the central example of their depression, is it's really bad thinking, right? Like, just taken on its merits as a thought process is kind of bad. And so if you can start from a process of trying to be more, to think more competently, to think more constructively, and for example, to get interested in the process in the experience of depression itself. It's like one of the more useful things I got out of the work from Matthew Ratcliffe, his book Experiences of Depression, is that it gave me a set of conceptual tools to treat depression as like a valid object of study in its own right, and so rather than essentially like thinking in loops about how life is terrible and I can't fix that, instead start thinking, oh, there's this big sort of mental object called depression. What happens if I just look really hard at that? Um, and you sort of, I think one of my interesting differences from a lot of other people who work in the space is that I had this decade of experience in like practical problem solving in the context of software, and also was reasonably good at not falling into the trap that other people often fall into. I mean, I fall into it as well, but like I'm of going, I understand this domain, therefore this other domain must be exactly like the domain that I already understand. And I think skill transfer between domains is hard, and most people's approach is to either not do it and basically go, okay, I will abandon all of my like cognitive tools that I've developed in this other domain, and I'll treat this new domain from scratch, or we'll try and sort of like shoehorn the new domain into fitting exactly the mold that they're used to, and neither of those really work. But I think if you can do skill transfer, and if you can sort of take like an existing practical problem solving toolkit and carefully port it over to the new environment in a way that sort of adapts well to the changes, then a lot of interesting things emerge. And so I think you can think, I guess what I'm saying is you can think your way out of depression, but the thought process has to be practical rather than abstract. And practical thought processes inevitably lead to action.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, so first of all, I just want to point out that in my life, I'm at a place, and I think a lot of humanity is in a place where you find that embodied practices, that there is maybe more openness to doing things with the body today. And it turns out that moving in certain ways, even in terms of skill transfer, it turns out that you can learn to use your body in a certain way, whether it's Tai Chi or a martial art. And even, these metaphors are created in the head that can get you out of ruts that are totally in the domain of thinking. So I'm really happy to see some developments over in that area. And also to touch on your point of overthinking, I always hated the maxim that ignorance is bliss. I would never want to lose 50 points of IQ and think less and think that this would make me somehow happier. I think is ridiculous. I think that you are duller, and therefore maybe you don't notice a lot of the things that bug sensitive people. Because I think intelligence, in a sense, is very closely related to sensitivity, in a sense, just seeing nuances and working with them and so on. And I always hated this maxim. And much like you, I think it just really matters what you think about. If you have the kind of brain power that you are currently misusing and you use for rumination, of course, that feels terrible. But imagine applying this to the right sort of thinking. You could advance yourself and humanity. So that's a really interesting thing which you just pointed out, this switch. And I'm open to hear from you what you think, how the switch can be made from just one mode of thinking in the domain of just like being daydreaming about the future or rumination and all that, into something different, and what that different thing could be for you.
In terms of how to make the switch, there are two possible, or at least two parts of that. One of them is, you mentioned embodied practices, and a lot of where I started figuring things out with was reading up a bit on focusing, which is by a therapist slash philosopher named Gendlin, which is essentially like starts from a process of paying attention to your body and sort of getting more in touch with like an intuitive physical sense, and in particular paying attention to whether something feels right and how that connects up with your sort of emotional landscape. And so I think that sort of provides one anchor point for grounding a thought process. And if you are not anchored in like how the thoughts actually connect up to your emotions, then you're essentially speculating without information, right? It's about as useful as coming into a new situation going, right, I know exactly what to do. I don't need to ask any of you any questions. You're just going to do things my way, and everything will be great. And like, and the other thing is, I think, grounding fairly immediately in things that you can actually do. I think one of my it's both a failing and a power, is that I get bored fairly quickly if I cannot see an actual outcome of the thing that I'm doing, and this is some major limitations on what I'm actually capable of doing as a result. And it's far from a positive feature, but it does mean that I'm not going to get stuck ruminating in the long thought process, because at some point I'm just going to get bored of the thought process. And so what I have very much learned as I think generically useful habit, even without this limitation, is to try to keep like roughly one step away from something I would actually do with the thought. And writing about it is often that one step. So I do a lot of public writing. I can highly recommend public writing as a practice. And I think one of the big step changes in my progress happened in early 2020 when I started a daily writing practice on my notebook blog, which just allowed me to get a lot of thoughts about this out of my head and sort of really started a conversation with the world about some of the ways I think about this and helped me articulate a lot of that. So I guess, yeah, one answer to how to stop unproductive thoughts loops in this space is just to write about it in public in a way that feels useful to, it feels like it would be useful to communicate to other people. I think that doesn't work for many people, because I think that there's often like a huge amount of anxiety tied up with public writing. I can recommend pseudonymous Twitter accounts as like a way around that, and potentially pseudonymous blogs. But I do think starting to there's a thing in general where your thought processes are always better when you're articulating them to someone else, and you can do this a little bit with like in programming we've got the idea of a rubber duck debugging, which is that you take a rubber duck and you explain your thoughts to them and you ask the rubber duck a question, and getting to the point where you can ask the rubber duck a question articulately is often enough to solve the problem. But real people work much better than ducks. And
well, if they're good listeners, they can be bringing their own baggage, which they just can't hold themselves back from sharing with you. But yeah.
Well, this is why writing is good. It's because you can write in public and nobody can interrupt you during the writing process. And yes, you will sometimes get bad commenters, but but like by and large, sharing your thoughts with the world makes those thoughts better, even if no one ever comments on it. And largely the comments are good and supportive. I mean, enabling comments on the blog is usually a mistake, but like comments on Twitter or wherever.
Nice. That's a good recommendation. Yeah, for me, I'm also trying because I share that history of depression with you. Then I'm reflecting on what got me out of it. And I think eventually a lot of it was getting to a point where I found this just place where I can be easier on myself as a first step, where, I would be up all night and having to do something in the morning, but you're there. And of course, if you're thinking about how you should have been asleep by now, that just exacerbates the whole thing. And you get more desperate to fall asleep. The less you're able to fall asleep, creates this loop. So for me, have developed this concept of just, I have this image of me just out in outer space, just letting radiation come through me, like not trying to protect myself, not trying to put up this shell around me or anything like that, but just completely letting go. And then just saying, even though last night I didn't sleep amazing, life goes on, right? Life goes on. And I think that's a good technique to maybe do it. Use some visualization where there's no tonus in your muscles whatsoever. And then another thing, like for me, I started from ruminations to move into dialectic, which is an art and a fun art. And like you, I can employ this curiosity that I have, so that it naturally leads me to delve deeper into that and building a model of the world with some of the interesting concepts that matters to us most. And once you find something that you're truly curious about and interested in, you will see that your attention shifts there, because that is a very powerful thing to follow our curiosity. So I'm wondering if that is something that you noticed in yourself. And I guess from what I understand, it was this whole big project of actually stepping out of depression that you were thinking about. But what was the method there? What were you trying to address?
So I think one big difference in our experiences of depression, I think, are that my depression was less constituted by lots of negative emotions. Like I very rarely have negative self-talk. It's so I agree that if you are regularly beating yourself up, figuring out ways of not doing that is super important. But my problem in general was much more like an absence of positive emotions rather than a presence of like intense negative emotions. It's much more about trying to figure out, like, low-grade emotional clutter is the way I think about it. Like constantly holding a certain degree of like anxiety and tension, but nothing that sort of ever spikes to a particularly high level. I should say, by the way, that depression is far from something I've fixed. I've got sort of an increasingly better toolkit for working with it, but unfortunately, I developed a great deal of that toolkit sort of early 2020, and there's been a little bit going on since then, as you may be aware. And so, like, it's sadly my current emotional toolkit is not quite up to the task of not being depressed during a pandemic. So particularly like the last couple of weeks have been quite bad for me, as all this news with Omicron rolls in, and so there's a very strong feeling of like, oh God, not again. And this kind of ties into and that one, I guess, is constituted somewhat by negative emotions, but or possibly negative feelings. I'm not sure if they're emotions, but either way, it's. But so I think this is like one of the important things that has sort of underlies a lot of my practice. I think I've sort of slightly meandered off your question. I apologize for that, but I'm going to keep talking anyway.
Go for it.
Which is that emotions are about things, and this feels like too obvious to say, but I think is often missed, and very often someone, when you sort of experience negative emotions about something, it's easy to treat like the negative emotions as the problem. So I often use anger as an example for this. Like when you get angry at someone, you will often sort of want to treat it as anger is the problem, and sort of think in terms of, okay, how can I be less angry? How can I calm down? But actually, like maybe that person is just being a dick to you. And maybe being angry is a completely sensible response in this context. And you can choose how to act on that anger. And there are very much more and less productive ways to be angry to act angrily. And fear is another example. If a tiger is coming for you, you should be afraid of that tiger.
Yep.
The problem is very much not afraid that you're afraid. The problem is that there's a tiger there. And so to a certain degree, depression is the sensible and rational response to the pandemic. This isn't 100% true, and there are also other sensible and rational responses to the pandemic that don't involve being depressed. But to the degree that depression is an experience of not knowing what to do, it felt sort of a feeling of constricted agency. Damn right, your agency is being constricted by the pandemic. There is sort of a loss of possibility in the world, which is like one of the principal feelings of depression. So I'm sorry, what was your question exactly? Because as I say, I have wandered off it.
No, well, I like where this went. I want to add that, yeah, absolutely. Negative feelings. That's another thing I'm very ambivalent about hearing. It's more about having the fitting emotions, because as you say, there are those times where it's absolutely fitting that we would be angry or fearful. And this is when you want these emotions. That's why they're there, because they helped us come all the way, through hundreds of thousands of years of turmoil around us and danger. So that's one thing that should be emphasized, that emotions are not necessarily negative. And I think that's a good point you're making about, first of all, on two levels, try dealing with emotions. The first is how you react. So maybe put a bigger buffer between the emotion and your action, so that you have more freedom there to choose what your action is. And then also think about the emotion itself and make it explicit to yourself in your own mind. What is anger good for? It is good for harnessing a lot of energy in a short time span to change things quickly, right? And when the time comes, once you realize this, when anger arises you in situation where this is exactly the thing that's called for, you will be happy to be angry. But if you come into a situation and somebody's telling you about a mistake they made a year ago that's irreversible and all that, well, maybe getting angry at that point is just not productive, So thinking about the emotion so that going forward you would be better adapted to dealing with situations, so that you would have more of a choice in what emotion to allow in you. And then also, like you said, put a buffer between an emotion and the output or the action from your body. And my question was, what were some of the things that you started actually concretely adding to your toolkit once the project started?
So yeah, concretely adding to my toolkit. So I mentioned focusing as the starting point for a lot of this, which is high level description is pay attention to your body in order to learn better to work with your intuitive sense of things. Another thing that I've set, there's a lot of stuff that I have added to my toolkit without really properly engaging with the source material, which I always find slightly embarrassing to admit to, but I think is still sort of important to acknowledge the influences of. So like other therapeutic techniques that have been influential to some large degree are sort of Jungian shadow work type things, internal family systems, and coherence therapy. And I'll briefly summarize each of these.
Yes, please.
Like the idea of sort of the Jungian shadow is that there are parts of yourself that you reject. You've essentially, at some point, usually in childhood, you have learned that this is in some way inappropriate, that this is in some way like bad. And you've sort of essentially tried to cut yourself off from them, but that doesn't work. And instead you've kind of put them in the shadow, in like the dark place inside you where you just like lock all the monsters and don't notice and pretend they aren't there. And as a result, you sort of become increasingly like less of yourself over time as you like lock more and more things away in the shadow. And there they essentially fester and become the worst versions of themselves because they're sort of dark and resentful and like want to be let out. And anger is a good example of this. I think a lot of people have most of their ability to express anger lurking in the shadow. And you particularly see this with people who bottle up all of their anger and most of the time pretend not to be angry at all, and then either just like snap sometimes or like don't acknowledge to themselves when they're clearly very angry. And so and this is the bit where my sort of I have to admit I haven't read that much Jung, and I haven't read that much of the surrounding work. I sort of essentially took the idea of shadow work from various like secondhand sources and ran with it. But learning to look at these parts of yourselves and sort of acknowledge that you have rejected them is one of the things that was very useful to me. Like a good way, a sort of a good standard test is essentially like to look at people who you find really irritating or like feel a lot of anger towards or some other negative emotion where you're just like, oh God, that person is terrible, I hate them. And try to figure out ways in which you might secretly want to be them or be like them, like they or the ways in which you might resent their behavior because you want to behave in similar ways. A trivial example of this for me is I get really annoyed by people's behavior on the underground, where they're just like they're just standing around in the way of people. They're standing in front of the doors. They're not really looking where they're going, and so you're constantly having to maneuver around them. And I'm aware that a lot of this is because it sure would be nice not having to like constantly monitor my environment, constantly have to actively learn to like not be in the way of people. And now there's just like a bit of me that I really don't feel like I'm allowed to switch off. And like it sure would be nice not to have to constantly be convenient. But
right.
And I currently don't experience that much because I don't go in the underground very much right now. But
no, that's really interesting, and it's also a cultural thing. So in Israel is fascinating because there are two very distinct cultures here along ethnic origins, basically. So Israel is one of the few places in the world, I think, where you can drive and you can see um, a settlement and another settlement, and you'll see like, oh, this type of building and architecture, it's definitely Jews that are living there, and over
Mm-hmm.
here are Arabs,
Mm-hmm.
Muslims or Christian, and there are many different differences between these cultures that are fascinating. One of them is driving. Okay, so in some of the Arab villages, you go and clearly everything is less orderly. Going into an Arab village, you might see cars standing in the middle of the road and somebody talking with their friend on the sidewalk.
Mm-hmm.
And just take the time for a couple of minutes, and they don't seem to care much that you stand behind them. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In other places, it's a lot more like your mindset, where, for me, it's like, okay, am I in the way? Am I in the way? If I want to talk with someone for 2 minutes, I'll make sure that I pull over, and so on. And you see very different cultures, and it takes a while to understand that uh, both are rational, both are fine if
Mm-hmm.
all the people around that person is in the same mindset. So
Mm-hmm.
I can be coming from my culture and be all upset about this happening. It's like, look at them driving here like that, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can understand, what is the big deal, really?
Mm-hmm.
So it takes a minute. It's like, here's this person talking with his friend, and like everything is fine by the end of it. Nothing happened. No big deal happened. So why not allow serendipitous hellos on the road? And it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of nice from a different perspective. So this is just an anecdote to kind of show that for me this was a real learning process about culture, about people, and about getting to be more of a pluralist, and realizing that other people are not doing the same thing that I do, but it's not drastically worse.
Mm-hmm.
And by extension, I am making peace with myself, which seems to be the purpose of the
Mm-hmm.
work you're doing there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And um, one of my sort of idiosyncratic syntheses here is that I tie like Jungian shadow work very tightly to philosophy of ethics, and in particular to the work of a obscure educational philosopher named Thomas Green, who does a lot of work essentially on how, or did a lot of work. He's dead now. He on moral education and how norms are formed and how we learn our emotional senses of right and wrong. And so, like, the things that go in the shadow are very much the things that you have culturally learned you are prohibited, that you feel guilt or shame about. Um, I would, however, like push back on a meta-ethical level, where I still think that my norms around the London Underground are correct, because ethics is fundamentally like it is a practical subject, right? It is a thing that you cannot theorize your way. You cannot like treat ethics as purely a theoretical question of right and wrong. Like your ethics have to be lived. And in the context of the London Underground, your ethics have to be lived in a way that lets people get from point A to point B. And
True.
so the set of norms that sort of work in a small village, for example, have a wide variety of expressions because and many of them are equally valid. But in the context of a very high volume of people in a small space, the set of ethics that allow a level of throughput at which the system works is quite tightly constrained.
Yep. You're totally right. And of course, ethics literally means things pertaining to customs or behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And by extension to personality. So of course, these are behaviors that we have to act
Mm-hmm.
out eventually, and not just have theoretical. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I mean, I am very much like an ethical pluralist. I don't think that there is a single objectively correct set of ethics. But I think that you do still have to evaluate ethics on the practical level of like what it does in the world, and in a given context and with a given set of aims, it is very much possible for like one set of norms to be strictly better than another. And I
Yeah, that's
acknowledge,
true.
I acknowledge that things are lost and a greater demand is placed on people by trying to follow my sort of norms of the underground that I consider optimal. But I think that not to be too Kantian about it, but basically like the system doesn't work if we adopt these norms, and trying to, as an individual, hold to a set of norms that disrupt the system is in some sense intrinsically unethical.
Yeah, well, it just strikes me as really funny, norms of the underground, where you think it's something about deep subconscious, but no, it's about the underground.
Yeah, I think I think it is also a deep subconscious thing. Like I think I do hold, I do hold to like a much higher degree of awareness of the impact of my actions on others than I think I actually like would endorse as correct for me, certainly like emotionally healthy for me, but also just correct in general. I think it comes out particularly strongly on the underground, because here is a situation where my norms are still probably overly strict, but it very much shows the level of not caring about this sort of thing that most people, or that many people, fall to.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
sort of, how can you not care about this even in this situation where it's
Yeah.
obviously important? I care about this even in situations where I probably shouldn't. Why aren't you willing to put in sort of like this bare minimum of effort?
Yeah, I definitely share that with you in some domains. What about IFS, internal family systems?
Yeah.
Could you expound
So
on that a bit?
Yeah, so internal family systems is similar in many ways to Jungian stuff. It's the idea that you are comprised of parts, where it's essentially, if you sort of listen to people talking colloquially, they when they're internally conflicted, they'll say something like, "Part of me believes that, I don't know, you don't want to spend time with me." Or part of me believes that I should be doing something else with my life. And the idea of internal family systems is to basically take that seriously and essentially have a conversation with that part. And it's an extension of focusing. It's a way of getting a little bit of distance from the part of you that believes some particular thing and saying, okay, so what's up? Why do you feel like that way? How can I help? What's going on? And internal family systems has this particular ontology of parts, categorization of parts, where it says that there are, I've encountered multiple different ontologies is for this. Like the one I learned is simpler than the one that is standard, which is that you have exiles and you have defenders. There's also like a 3-part version which says you have exiles, you have managers, and you have firefighters. And I never remember like the split here. But sort of the relevant thing for this is that an exile is it's in some way like hurt, or it's like a younger traumatized version of yourself, usually, that is afraid of the world and doesn't want to be let out into it. And a defender is sort of standing in between it and the world. Internal family systems is about basically identifying an exile, identifying the defender that is protecting it, asking the defender to essentially just step out of the way for a little bit and let you have a conversation with the exile. And then essentially offering love and compassion and curiosity to the exile, basically trying to be the ideal compassionate parent figure that the exile needed to progress past the point where it got stuck.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that's how an internal family systems practitioner would explain it to you.
But I really like it that you're bringing your own version, possibly not based on the material sources, but this is all what we do, and your own version is still legitimate if it's working for you. So that's good. And what was the third practice
one
that you mentioned?
Was coherence therapy.
Yeah.
And coherence therapy is it's so I described internal family systems as what happens when you start taking the question like part of me believes seriously. And coherence therapy is sort of like when you do the same, but you put the emphasis on belief rather than part. It starts with the idea that emotional reactions are represent beliefs. It is a belief that this is the correct emotional reaction to be having right now. You get angry, it's because at some level or in some way you believe that the correct thing to do is to be angry right now, or afraid, or one of various other emotions. And so you have this belief because it was at some point in your life useful to have this belief. And what you do, and so the thing you do in coherence therapy is you go, okay, I believe this right now. Why do I believe this? And is that correct? And again, this is now somewhat a idiosyncratic framing of it, but the way I look at this is that you have to go into this with the attitude of it might be correct. It's if I am angry for good reasons, then I will act on that anger. I won't do that necessarily by being sort of shouty and aggressive, but I will in some way like act on the belief that that I currently possess. And if it doesn't feel correct, this is the coherence therapy bit. What you do is you essentially go, okay, this was a reasonable belief in the context in which it was learned. It might not have been a correct belief. Like one of the things that comes up a lot of the time is that this was a learned strategy back when you were a small child, and small children are kind of dumb and not very good at strategy. So it may be that like even at the time there was clearly a better thing for you to be doing, but you were not capable of finding that better thing. And so one of the things that you can point out to the belief is I'm an adult now, I'm smarter, I have better strategies available to me, let's do this instead. But it might also be I'm an adult now, I'm no longer forced to go into school like by a legal mandate, or I no longer have to deal with that particular authority figure who I learned this in response to. And essentially treating yourself as not bad for having this belief, but highlighting and like really internalizing the things that are different about the situation that you are currently experiencing from the situation in which it made sense to have this belief. And I no longer use this frame, but it was really useful to me when sort of initially developing it, which is there's a distinction from a philosopher whose name I can never remember, of A-leafs and B-leafs. A belief is something you think, an A-leaf is something you feel. So essentially, if you know something is true but it doesn't feel true, then that's a conflict between your A-leafs and your B-leafs. And so I sometimes think of coherence therapy as the practice of trying to have the same A-leafs and B-leafs.
Oh,
Um,
gotcha. Yeah,
and importantly, like sometimes that changes the B leaves, and sometimes that changes the A leaves. Um,
yeah, that's interesting. And as you mentioned, all of them, I'm trying to abstract the thing that's present in all of them, and I think all of them are trying to, first of all, employ reason
mhm.
to a good end, and then also you can see very clearly that they're about making peace, right,
Mhm.
with yourself internally, and then harmonizing things outside of you in nature, right? Nature
Mhm.
being everything, including other people.
Yeah.
And that is, first of all, shares this thing with dialectic, which is what I do, the art of just creating a good representation of the world with concepts in your mind.
Mhm.
So that when you apply this model that you have, you get good results because this model is accurate and true and
Mhm.
not haphazardly put. Because, like you say, we grow up as children, we do all sorts of stuff, and sometimes we get stuck in a rut that there's really no reason to be stuck in. Um, and that's where it really resonates with living well, which is not a state but a mode of sustainable harmony. And you could
Mhm.
also call it health for all purposes,
Mhm.
because health in the body is just this ability to be in homeostasis over time and be as capable as you can be, right? Partly
Mhm.
also um, to to repeat the process and keep yourself healthy. And that's what we want to do with our soul. We want to be in a place where it's healthy enough so that it does what it is good for itself. And that is what I'm abstracting from all the techniques which you've just shared. And I'm wondering now, um, when things are starting to get better for you, then with the insights you're gaining, how does it feel subjectively in terms of conducting yourself in the world?
Um, that's a good question. I think one of the clearest subjective changes is a significant reduction in anxiety. It's like I used to have a lot of social anxiety, for example. And in an example of really, really poor timing, I fixed this right at the beginning of 2020. Um, but uh, and there are other anxiety triggers that I definitely haven't fixed yet. I still get anxiety over paperwork, for example, which is sufficiently entrenched that I haven't quite managed to get to the bottom of that one. But in general, like the biggest subjective change is sort of constant incremental expansion of the situations in which I can act without being anxious. Um,
And anxious, what? Uh, how does that feel? What are you describing there? Is it just the being anticipating something bad happening, or being
um,
too caught up in your own mind that you're missing the moment of or
uh, it's anxiety isn't a mind thing for me. It does sometimes result in like unproductive overthinking loops, but like my experience of anxiety is primarily physical. Like it's a whole body flinch reaction.
mm,
Um, a distinction I often use is um, that anxiety is not actually the same as worry, and it's not being. And so I describe like worry as being afraid of a specific bad outcome, while as anxiety is more like discomfort with the range of the space of possible outcomes. It's discomfort with uncertainty is how I'd often frame it. And so it's it's more like a negative reaction to having to navigate the space of possibilities at all. So like you go to a party and you have social anxiety because you're just like, oh God, who do I talk to? What do I do? What is there is an infinite space of things you could do in this context, and you don't know what the right one is. You don't know how to.
That's
And
amazing. I mean, the framing of anxiety as a whole body flinch is something I'm definitely going to snatch from you and carry forward and use in future conversations. And also, you can see that logically, of course, we understand that if we are in a different mindset, we can be excited and happy about having many possibilities, right? So you can imagine yourself being exhilarated by a lot of good possibilities out there, but anxiety is just approaching things from a battle already lost kind of mindset, maybe, or so that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it often comes so anxiety and depression, I think, are thought of as like different things, but if you sort of look at people who experience one or the other, they're very tightly tied together. And I think this sort of ties way back into what you were talking about of depression as overwhelm and sort of not knowing what to do next. And I think this is in many ways like why they're so tightly tied together. It's like depression is not knowing what to do next. Anxiety is being overwhelmed by the space of possibility, or being afraid of the space of possibilities of what to do next. And so anxiety, I think, will naturally lead to depression in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. So in terms of walking out in the world without this anxiety, now that you've obtained some or mastered some techniques to help well, long term. I'm going to ask a slightly leading question. Would the concept of flow describe any of the being in like post anxiety?
I understand why you're asking the question. This is not.
But I should say it's not flow. Well, what I'm thinking in my mind, being thinking in Greek sometimes, is euroia. So euroia or euroia is the Stoic concept of good flow. Literally, it means good flow, but it's not the flow of being very, very productive and accurate in your actions within a frame or within a frame of like an hour or two. It's about long-term, just feeling in general more in harmony with the world. So that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think the thing that I think that is missing, and why flow still doesn't feel quite right to me, and maybe this is a difference in our usage to some degree, is that a reduction in anxiety gets you out of your own way, but it doesn't come with a sense of purpose. It doesn't come with a, like, you can get rid of anxiety by basically going, okay, I can do whatever I want. It doesn't matter. Like every choice is a good choice. But without some sort of positive principle to on which to make choices, what you have is drift, not flow.
Yeah. I love it. That's a really good point. And building that positive thing to work for, I think, is where really, again, dialectic comes in, but really thinking about what you're trying to achieve and understanding that what you're doing is good for something, and starting to look at your life from that perspective. Well, I'm doing this, it's good for that, which is good for that thing, which is good for that thing. And all the good fours are added into this great big chain. So each one is a link, each action is a link, but where does it all lead us? And I think ultimately the answer should be doing well or living well, well-being, mental health. It can be framed separate. ways. But yeah, so is that where you'd like to kind of, or is that where you would define an end to that chapter, where getting rid of depression and anxiety, or did you develop some things that relate to the next stage of what actually to do?
I'm still working on that bit, if I'm honest. It's a partly because I haven't currently fixed the depression and anxiety part like as much as I would like to, and partly because I end up with a big question mark, question mark, question mark every time I try and figure out this step. And I think that some of the reason why is that I've made all this progress during the worst possible time to make progress on this particular problem, because I think that positive purpose requires other people in a way that it's not impossible to do during the pandemic, but I think that it's very hard. And I think of a lot of these things as skill development. And one of the sort of key features of skill development is that you should always be trying to do things that are slightly outside of your comfort zone. And if you do things that are only within your comfort zone, then you don't get better because you already know how to do those things. But also if you do things that are vastly outside your comfort zone, you also don't get better because like you just fail completely and you have no ability to get positive feedback on like what you did well and what you did badly. If you're trying to learn to play piano, then you don't sit down and immediately start trying to play an elaborate Mozart concerto or whatever, because what will happen is you'll just make a mess. You don't. We talk about throwing people at the deep end and letting them learn to swim, but no, that's how you get people to drown.
Yeah.
You start people in the shallows, you sort of get them comfortable with the water. And I think one of the problems I'm having right now is that the pandemic creates a higher activation for everything, a higher activation energy for everything. And as a result, clears out a lot of the immediate periphery of my comfort zone. There are loads of obvious next steps, and all of them are made somewhat inaccessible or significantly higher anxiety, and anxiety of a form where I can't fix the anxiety because the anxiety is actually a rational response to the situation. It's in much the same way that sometimes it's right to be angry, sometimes it's right to be fearful, sometimes it's right to be anxious because if I'm organizing a group event, there's genuinely a lot of negative uncertainty there. I need to do a huge amount of risk planning. So yeah, and a lot of this feels like excuses, but I think is sort of a mix of true and excuses. But yeah, positive purpose is sort of my next step and what I'm still working on out is, I guess, the short answer to that.
Nice. So yeah, first of all, thank you so much for being so candid and open throughout this. And I don't take it for granted that you're able to tell the truth as it is. I really wish for all of us to come out of this pandemic already and get to do the positive things. I will say to anybody listening that to me, a lot of the next step of what to actually aim for starts with the question of what mental health is. And not in the sense that you can go to the DSM-5 and look at all the recognized illnesses, that are just so obvious and so glaring that, okay, you can say this person has some sort of syndrome. Let's be skeptical about all of us here, even if we don't have anxiety, even if we don't have depression, in ways that are recognizable. maybe we're not completely healthy. Maybe being healthy is something a bit over that. And this is eventually what we want to do. We want to be healthy physically if possible, and we definitely want to be healthy mentally if possible. And I think it also is related to all the practices that you mentioned that are all about making peace within oneself. Yeah, David, thank you so much for taking the time. I'd like you to share with the listeners any venues that they can find you writing in, thinking in, and so on.
Yeah, and thank you very much for having me. So, in terms of places to find me thinking and writing in, there are basically three places. There's in order of sort of increasing level of well-formedness of thought. There's me on Twitter as Dr. MacIver. There's my notebook blog, which is for long form writing that is sort of first draft quality. It's like off the cuff thoughts. That's at notebook.drmaciver.com. And for the most polished of my writing currently, there is my newsletter titled Overthinking Everything, which is drmaciver.substack.com. And rather than having to spell this, I assume there will be links in the description.
Yes, there will be. And I can say personally that I recommend it. I love your writing and the clarity of it, and also the depth that you go to in analyzing different subjects. So thanks again, David. And I'll be happy to do a follow-up when the pandemic is over and see if we all made it out okay.
Sounds great. Thank you very much, Ayan.